Prodigal series, we have begun talking about things that are missing, things that we're missing when we leave the presence of the Father and we venture into the world away from Him. Last week we talked about the absence of truth in our world, and this week I want to talk to you a little bit about the absence of order. I have mentioned before that when I was in grad school, I had a job for a while as a cook in a preschool, and as part of my job, I was to make breakfast and lunch every day for about 100 preschoolers, and I had an assistant. My assistant was a man named Randy. He was a grown man. He was an autistic man, pretty high-functioning autistic, and he was responsible for keeping my kitchen clean. And he was good at it. He was difficult at times. He called me Doug Parks. Always Doug Parks. And he would come in and sort of grill me with the same questions every day. You're Doug Parks? Yes. You're married to Lisa Parks? Yes. So we would go through this routine every morning. And then he would pick up the pans and things as I was using them and put them all away. Now, he knew how the kitchen was supposed to be ordered. And because he knew how the kitchen was supposed to be ordered, he was a little annoyed that people ever actually used the pans and utensils in the kitchen. So as soon as you got them out, you could see his agitation. He's just waiting to collect that up, and sometimes he wanted to collect them up before I was actually done using them. And so over the couple of years that I was there, I eventually developed a bit of impatience with him and got a little annoyed with him at times. And since I have left there, and this is a long time ago now, since I have left there, I have felt regret that was the best assistant you could possibly have. Everything went back into its place immediately. He was fantastic. It was so nicely ordered. If you've ever ventured into my shop at the house, you know that my life is not like that, right? When my kids were working for me, Jessie would do the best that she could to keep me in order, but nobody kept things ordered as much as Randy did. Having that sort of order in life is a great feeling. I have a tendency to let things go too long and then to clean them up. And when you get them cleaned up, that is rewarding, right? That feels fantastic. I was sharing with some people here recently, my office for the last year had just collected stuff from every event that we put on. And so there's less and less seating space for people who come into my office because there's just piles of things from Honor Club and sermon series and all these different things. And so the day after New Year's, I came in and cleaned my office. I said, I'm going to clean this office once a year, whether it needs it or not. Got my office cleaned. It didn't last very long, but it felt great while everything was in order. What's weird, though, is as good as it feels for things to be in order, when someone outside of ourselves imposes order on us, we get upset. We resent it. Now, granted, not all order is good order. If you've ever worked for the government, you know that there's a bureaucratic order that doesn't always make sense, and it's sort of frustrating, and that sort of order always sort of chapped my hide. There's a traditional order that comes up a lot of times working in churches. We say, why exactly do we do it like that? We don't know, we just always have. That sort of order I've never had much patience for. So there's some kinds of order that are not that great. But even when the order is good, and even when we agree that the order is good, when that order comes from something external, we tend to feel that order is an imposition. And that's not rational, that's not particularly reasonable, but I think it reflects our fallen nature, because ultimately we are a people who have rejected God's order. The order of God is the divine order of creation. We look at our world around us, there's a remarkable balance to everything. Everything is set in place and set in motion in a very specific way. Scripture tells us that God set the stars in the sky, and he gives boundaries to the ocean. And as we learn more about our world, we understand that the world has been formed into environments and habitats, and that there is a delicate balance, an extremely delicate balance of things that God not only initiated but holds in place, and that the world is governed by natural law. Natural laws. This is the basis of modern science, the assumption that the world is governed by natural laws, which, ironically, that idea arises from the Christian message. That there are natural laws because there is a lawgiver. But it's not just about how creation works. It's not just about the physical realities of our world. It is about how things are happening on a spiritual level. And on a spiritual level, there is a right way. There's a right way for things to happen. There's a right way for us to live. There's a right way for us to be engaged in relationship. There's a right way for us to make our way through the world that is bound up in God, in God's righteousness. Now, when we think of righteousness, we are often drawn to think of the law, like the law of Moses. But I want you to consider that the law of Moses is a relative latecomer to the game. That humanity existed for thousands of years before God issued a law. Why is that? Before the law of Moses was given, there was still right and wrong. There were still sins committed. There's still judgment for those sins. But there was no law. And we can understand that by understanding this, that if we observe the divine order, rules are largely irrelevant. The rules do not define what righteousness is. Righteousness comes first. When we're pursuing righteousness, we probably don't need all of the rules. Rules exist because we are trying to skirt the order of God. If we're pursuing the order of God, the rules are unnecessary. We try to skirt them. If you've ever owned an ATV or a jet ski or other recreational toys, vehicles, you might have seen this decal next to the gas cap. Never use a lit match or open flame to check fuel level. Now, you know there's a story there, right? There's a story of somebody that I can't see down into the gas tank. Let me get my lighter. You know there's a story there. The rule exists not because it defines righteousness, but because it defines what someone did to avoid righteousness. How someone tried to skirt the order. And when we think about biblical history, in the garden, right, we effectively have this one rule. Don't eat from this tree. And then we've got thousands of years of history. And then suddenly there's 10 rules etched into stone. And from those 10 rules, we extrapolate 613 commandments, more or less, depending on how you count them, 613. Then you come into the rabbinical era with the Pharisees, and the number of rules becomes virtually uncountable, because the Pharisees have all kinds of rules that they extrapolate from those 613 commandments. But then Jesus comes along, and Jesus says all of them, in summary, come down to two. The two are love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. These two rules, in turn, basically just reflect order. They reflect God's nature. They reflect God's will. And Jesus, about himself, says, I didn't come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill the law. Christians often have a hard time understanding what that means. And they always, or not always, but a lot of times seem to circle around to the idea that Jesus is essentially saying, I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to abolish the law. Fulfilling the law is not the same thing as abolishing the law. What Jesus is saying, and it's clear from the context of the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus is saying is the law doesn't define righteousness. It just points to righteousness. So how am I going to fulfill the law? I'm going to be righteous, and you're going to see what that looks like. That's the fulfillment of the law, and he's the only one who's ever fulfilled it. Isaiah 26:3, the prophets, God says through his prophet, you will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. Jesus is going to be steadfast and faithful. He's going to trust in the Father. And the prophet says that is our peace. The order of God is the source of shalom. Shalom being the Hebrew word for peace, but it's more than that. It's wholeness, it's completeness, it's the content of living inside the order in which we are meant to live. In other words, the order of God is really, really good. And it's really, really good for us. And in a sense, it's even really, really simple. Just love God and love others. That summarizes the whole package. Except that it's not simple. It's not simple for us because we are pretty far removed from what all of that looks like. We're far removed from the order of God, and we don't do a great job at loving God, and we don't do a great job at loving others. It's not familiar to us. And how did we get here? Well, despite the goodness, the inherent goodness of God's order, we are tempted to believe that God's order is oppressive. That's what Satan whispers into our ear all the time. That's what he whispers to Eve in the garden. It's an irrational assumption that God's goodness somehow is, in fact, the problem. I remember distinctly as a kid, my young friend Brian and I, best friend from up the street, Brian and I had a very elaborate plan for how we were going to run away. We had talked about all the things we were going to take with us. We're going to fill our little red wagons. We're going to take our wagons. We're going to take my pony Dusty. And we were going to run away from home. We were going to find an abandoned farm, and we were going to live there. This is our great plan. And we were going to do all of this because our parents were mean. And by mean, I mean our parents loved us and gave us everything we needed. That was mean. But they also set limits for us. They also set limits, and they also had expectations. And how annoying is that? That is, oh my goodness, that's frustrating. You see the point. Sometimes the order that is being imposed upon us is actually really good. It might be genuinely deeply good, but because it comes from a source outside of ourselves, we have this dream about casting that order off. And what do we embrace in place of that order but chaos? Now, chaos is a childish fantasy of selfish impulse. And such is the dream of the prodigal son in the story. Wait until I get out of Dad's house. Wait until I'm not under his... You can't believe the things I'm going to do. Wait until I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. Because that's a really good prescription for life, right? And we can't. We can't. We can't do whatever we want, whenever we want, even when we get out from under mom and dad's rule. We can't because, life. Life shows us otherwise. I think back on our runaway plan, and I think, we hadn't really considered how we were going to eat or where we were going to sleep. It's not a complete plan. Life has other ideas. In reality, we can probably do less. If we came from a loving home, we can probably do less with freedom from mom and dad than we did when we lived with them. Because we find out pretty quickly that mom and dad were doing all the hardest stuff for us. But even if we could, is a life guided by our selfish impulses anything less than a recipe for disaster? And that's why the wise impose godly order wherever chaos would reign. And in fact, God instructs humanity to do just that. In Genesis 1, he tells Adam and Eve to subdue creation, to rule over it. Now, because of sin, because of the fall of man, that rule has become a battle for control. And it's all about our selfish intent. But what is God's intent? God's intent is that mankind, created in the image of God, will be agents of God's order throughout the world. Not that we will shirk that order, not even just that we'll live in that order, but that we'll actually be agents of that order, advancing God's order throughout all of the creation. The father in the prodigal story is an agent of godly order. And it's that order against which humanity has rebelled. And so we get these messages in Scripture, like Paul talking in Ephesians 6, verse 1. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." So here's an important principle. Children, obey your parents. Why? Paul says we're going to enjoy a long life. You ever wondered about that? How exactly does that work? Obey your parents, enjoy a long life. Well, it works like this. Obedience is going to reintroduce into your life the order of God that is so missing from the world. Order leads us to shalom. It leads us to peace. It leads us to goodness. But we still have to read the next verse. Verse 4 says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord." You see, the gospel presumes that the faithful will once again be agents of God's order. It's not simply that children have to obey their parents. It's also that parents will be agents of God's order in their children's life. And it doesn't just apply to that. It really applies to everything. We are to be agents of God's order in our own life, agents of God's order in our relationships, in our home, in our churches, in our community. But it didn't work out that way. You go back to the garden, and what do you find? Mankind not only rejects the order of God, but quits its job. We abdicated the agency of God's order. And so we read the curse, the so-called curse, in Genesis 3, where God is describing what's going to happen now. I don't even think it's really a curse. I don't think this is God reaching out and creating new punishments in response to what's happened. I think this is God explaining some small taste of the disorder that you just introduced into the world. You just unleashed this because you not only rejected the order of God, the prime principle of which is God gets to be God and you don't. Not only have you rejected that order, but you actually surrendered your agency. You surrendered your rule to evil. Or as Paul says in Romans 1, they claimed to be wise, but they became fools. So here's our human heritage. Faced with the loving presence, provision, and purpose of God, humanity chose chaos rather than godly order. The big problem there is that chaos creates a vacuum that humanity then feels compelled to fill up again. See, order always feels like an imposition until you don't have it anymore. And you realize the lack of order is just going to be chaotic. And chaos leaves us anxious and uncertain and angry and compulsive. In fact, it's generally agreed that obsessive compulsive behavior is a response to chaos. We develop these behaviors because we're trying to have a sense of control in a world that feels like it's out of control. And most of us, whether we have a diagnosis or not, most of us have some area of life where we're a little bit obsessive compulsive. It doesn't get labeled as a disorder until it starts to disrupt life and become a problem. But we have disorders for everything now, don't we? Oh, lots and lots of disorders. We're constantly creating new ones to try to explain what's going on. Lots of disorders. I have a different theory. I have a better theory, I think. I think the world has a disorder. The world is broken by the rejection of godly order. It attempts to find substitutes. And when we replace the order of God, we don't get a new order. We get a false order. We get a disorder. God says through the prophet Jeremiah, "My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." In other words, not only do my people reject my order, but they replace me with an order that actually isn't order. And that disorder is born of selfish ambition. The selfish ambition is a term that we see in the New Testament. It's used a lot by Paul. It's also used by James. And the interesting thing is, selfish ambition is one of those things that's always cited among lists of other major sins. And what's interesting about that is Western culture, in a lot of ways, selfish ambition has become the highest possible human virtue. That's how much we've flipped the script. The selfish ambition is thinly disguised temper tantrums. It's what I want, when I want it, regardless of the goodness of it, regardless of the virtue of it, regardless of its impact on others. This is how we try to order the world outside of God, and it doesn't work. And one of the main reasons it doesn't work is because everybody else around us is pursuing their selfish ambitions. And so how do we decide who gets their way and when do they get it? And this is why for most of human history, disorder is perpetuated by might. Whoever was strongest, that's who gets to say what the new order is. For most of human history, the order of things, or the disorder of things, was decided by who had the power to enforce their will and force it upon other people. Outside of the order of God, it all becomes a battle for who gets to be in charge. So women had no real freedom because they were subject to the domination of men. And men had no real freedom because they were subject to the economic power of landlords and the wealthy. And landlords and the wealthy had no real freedom because they were subject to the military might of kings. And kings had no real freedom because they have to spend their whole monarchy looking over their shoulder, waiting for the next challenger. Because at times people will grow tired of their kings and tyrants. And they will gather together and they will overthrow them. And then what happens? With very few exceptions, they replace the old king and tyrant with a new king and tyrant. And we have not moved from disorder to order. We have not moved into godly order. We have simply moved from one disorder to another. The oppressed may gain power, but almost invariably the oppressed just then become the oppressors. Because this life has sort of degenerated into that quest for power, and that power is to be used to build upon selfish ambition. But then Jesus shows up. And Jesus says in Matthew 5, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God." And what is that all about? It's about this. In the kingdom order, goodness is not reserved for the powerful. It doesn't belong to the elite. It doesn't belong to the kings, the monarchs, the emperors. And what's amazing about this, as we think about our existence today, we ought to understand that Western society has largely freed itself from the tyranny of kings by building on this simple principle, this belief that every one of God's children deserves goodness. Now, people still pursue power. They pursue it politically and economically and socially and emotionally. But ironically, it's this unique freedom that we have in the Western world, this freedom that we enjoy that now has come to undergird our selfish ambition. See what's happened is we have a freedom that's deeply rooted in these Christian principles that we use in order to defy Christian principles. Paul kind of warned us about this in Galatians 5, verse 13. He says, "You, my brothers and sisters, you were called to be free, but don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself." Don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh, but that's exactly what our world is doing. The prevailing lie of the day is this, that divine order is a threat to freedom. It's really a new version of a very old lie. That the love-driven order of God that brings us shalom, that brings us peace and wholeness and contentment, is secretly an oppressive order. It's secretly robbing us of fun and freedom and potential. What we really want is to pursue our own version of disorder. And that's the second half of this big lie, is that everyone's disorder is equally valid. Now, this is fascinating because, again, we've taken a uniquely Christian idea and we've tried to make it fit with this worldly approach. The Christian idea is that goodness is not reserved for the powerful, it's not reserved for the elite, it's not reserved for the worthy or for the wealthy, but that all of God's children can be recipients of God's goodness. We're still holding on to that idea, but we can't make that idea work because the order that we're pursuing is not actually the order of God. It is disorder. It is selfish ambition. And if you doubt me on that, all you got to do is find somebody who's preaching this kind of tolerance in our culture, contradict them, and watch how quickly and suddenly they become viciously intolerant. Because ultimately, this is still all about power, it's still all about control, it's still about my selfish ambition and getting to do what I want, when I want, regardless of the consequences. In contrast, the eternal truth is this: everyone's disorder is equally invalid. Because it's a disorder of selfish ambition perpetuated by might. Who would have thought something like that would actually just be chaos in disguise? It's not godly order. It's not shalom. It is the proverbial lipstick on the prodigal's pigs. And the second half of that truth is this: submission to God's order is liberating. See, we have this all backward. When we think of godly order, we think of rules. We think of following the rules, and following the rules feels very oppressive. But you got to remember that the rules only exist because of the disorder. Paul says in 1 Timothy 1 that the law is not for the righteous. The law is for sinners, to define sin. We got to understand that the objective of our message, the objective of the gospel, the objective of Christianity is not figuring out how to follow the rules better, but how to follow Jesus better. Because when we follow Jesus, the rules become irrelevant. This is not about finding ways to avoid doing evil. It's about finding ways to pursue righteousness. And Jesus says in Matthew 16, Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." In other words, as Jesus says himself in John 8, in Jesus we are free indeed. Now we consider this one of the great paradoxes of Scripture, this idea that you got to give your life up in order to find your life. But we only think it's a paradox because we have, for all our life, believed that there is life and goodness to be found outside of God. And it isn't there. So only by losing that, only by surrendering that, only by returning to God through Christ do we ever find the life that we were looking for in the first place. And so Jesus goes on, he says, "What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" In other words, we search the whole world looking for an order of things that will work for us, that will bring us peace. We look everywhere but God. And only in the order of God will we find peace in life. It's the only place. Because the kingdom order leads to abundant life. This is why Jesus says, "I came." Jesus says in John 10, this is why I'm here, that they may have life and they might have it more abundantly. It's the only place to get it. The only place to get it. Because Jesus is not about power. He's not about selfish ambition. He is about the goodness of God. And every disorder, no matter who holds it, every disorder will ultimately be about serving some kind of selfish ambition. It is only God's order that exists exclusively to bring us life, and that more abundantly. And why does it work? Well, it works because our King is a different kind of king. He doesn't work like worldly kings. He doesn't think like worldly kings. In fact, he says in that same passage in John 10, "I'm the one who lays down my life." That's the kind of ruler I'm going to be. An agent of the one true order. It's not about control, it's not about domination, it's not about oppression, it's about shalom. It's about peace. It's about freedom to live in the righteousness of God. Now, I figure there's a good chance that I'll never be that guy who's got a clean desk or an orderly shop. But I want to live in the order of God because it's the only source of life.